Hey everyone, Bond here from Dr. Pennsylvania. We got episode 43 all ready to go for you. Thank you all for your patience. So the source material here originally came out in the early 1930s, first as a letter from the Northwestern Pennsylvania Raftsmen Association, and then shortly thereafter from a Clarion newspaper. And the piece is called An Old Timer's Early Thrills on the River. And the original author is Peter McDonald of Vaunicle, PA, which I believe is in Clarion County. But this is a really fun little piece we put together, so I hope you guys like it. As always, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook or drop us a line at drpennsylvania@gmail.com.
An Old Timer's Early Thrills on the River by Peter McDonald of Vaunicle, Pennsylvania. As this is my 86th birthday and I have a holiday, I will try and write my first experience as a raftsman on the Clarion and Allegheny Rivers. My experience as a raftsman up to the time of this story, which was in December of 1862, was of the traditional style handed down by my father David McDonald, who helped Davis Munn run several rafts down the Clarion to Lower Hillvale. There he sold them to Jacob Hill, who had a boat scaffold and furnished 100-foot boats for the Pittsburgh coal companies. These boats were dropped into the water without aid of lines. My father and Mr. Munn used grapevines for cable to anchor the rafts. David Munn ran his first raft about 1840. He had purchased 150 acres on Troutman Run near the Clarion. He and his wife lived and died on that piece of ground, and their tombstones are standing there to this day. They should have a monument. As I pass their lonesome resting place, it brings back memories of earlier days of the lumbering and rafting business, and along with these memories of their many hardships the early pioneers had to endure. Well, getting back to my own experience, my rafting up to the year 1862 had been learned from my father and an old raftsman by the name of William Doherty. He would go down the river on every flood, and when returning home he would stop at father's and tell all the experience that had occurred on that trip, and of his narrow escapes. These stories, and those of my father's, filled me with a longing to go down to Pittsburgh, so in December of 1862, when I was 14 years old, I heard that there was going to be some rafts leaving Clarington on a certain day. I told Tom McCloskey, a neighbor boy about my age, about it, and we decided to go down the evening before and see if we could get a trip. We started from home for Clarington, which was 9 miles away, at about dark. When we arrived at the town, everything seemed to be closed up for the night. We hurried down to the river and boarded a raft and began pulling the oars and keeping them from freezing, and also for the practice. We worked all night, and by early morning we began to feel hungry. We had 5 cents between us, so Tom went to a house and bought a loaf of bread. We ate the bread and drank water from the river and felt refreshed. There were several rafts to start, but they seemed all have their full crews. We asked several men for a trip, but they would answer with a smile, "We don't need any more men." Tom and I were discouraged and about ready to leave for home, but we met a man who told us that another raft would be leaving during the day, and if we would stay around, perhaps we would get a trip. This man proved to be John Brandon, the owner of the raft that we had practiced on all night. Well, about noon, Tom and I took our places on the raft along with John Davis and Conrad Barr, the pilot. Everything went nicely that day, and we landed at Mill Creek and tied up the raft. Tom had gone to the boarding house, John Davis was on the raft fixing something, and Conrad and I were on the bank when a raft came down the river, struck ours, and took John and the raft down river. There was a skiff on the beach that belonged to the landlord, and Conrad tried to buy or rent it, but he refused to do either, so we took it. We found it locked, but I took a stone and broke the lock. Conrad and I took the skiff and started after John on the loose part of the raft, the greater part having been torn away when it was struck. We caught up with John some time later, and Conrad drifted the raft toward the shore. I took a short line and tried to find a tree, but it was too dark and stormy. The only anchor I could find was a rock, but the raft pulled the rock into the water, and John and Conrad went on. I was almost frozen, but fortunately a light in the distance gave me courage. I found my way down the riverbank to the house, which proved to be a hotel at the Clarion River Bridge. I told the landlord that I wanted to stay all night and that I had no money. He said, "I don't keep customers of your caliber." I then told him that if he did not keep me, I would stone every window out of his house. I don't know who would have come out best. Fortunately, a man hearing my argument came out of the hotel and told the landlord to give me some supper, a bed, and breakfast. The man's name was Mr. Furman. I ate a big supper and had a good night's rest. After breakfast, Mr. Furman told me that he was going down the river and would give me a lift. I helped him get to the skiff and into the water, and we started after John and Conrad. We finally caught up with him at Piney Eddy. I had helped Mr. Furman, and he gave me $2 besides my hotel expense. This was the first money I ever earned on the river. The next thing was to gather up our scattered timber, so John and another boy stayed at the raft while Conrad and I took the leaky skiff and started up the river. Several pieces had been caught by the millmen. They claimed all that was not stamped and wanted 50 cents apiece for catching it. We had no money, but as it was getting dark, we took all we found that was not marked and floated them down to John, who rafted them in. After that, everything went good to the mouth of the river, and John Brandon said, "That was the best wreck I ever had, as we had more timber when we finished than when we started." I was at the mouth of the Clarion then, still longing to see Pittsburgh. I managed to get on a raft of square timber owned by John O'Neill and Company. We coupled 4 rafts and started with our fleet as quickly as possible, as the weather was getting very cold and there was danger on the river freezing over. We landed somewhere down the river and put up for the night. Early the next morning, when we started out again, it was so cold that we broke up the extra oars and made a fire on the raft. This annoyed the oil boats, as they were afraid of the sparks. That evening we reached Freeport, 28 miles from Pittsburgh, tied up our fleet, and just at that time a fleet of boats belonging to James Clark drifted in alongside of ours. The men were almost frozen. One man by the name of Conrad Myers had to be carried off the raft. He never recovered from the exposure. Oh yes, those boats drifted downstream and were found frozen in the middle of the river the next morning. At this time, I decided not to go any further, as the Allegheny Railroad only came to Kittanning, and they told me to not ride on it as it was unsafe because of slides from the river hills. It would have been a long walk down to Pittsburgh and back. I started to walk home by way of Worthington, Middlesex, East Brady, Clarion, and Lucinda, and reached home about midnight with $10 in my pocket for the Clarion River trip and $15 for the Allegheny run. Oh yes, about Tom. He got another raft the next morning at Mill Creek and went to visit some of his relatives and did not come home for 3 weeks. There was considerable anxiety at his home about him, and all I could tell them was that I had left him at Mill Creek.